Okay, this is a quick piano update. Let's just see if I can get your serial number. I don't see the serial number. I think I saw one over here. Yeah, that's your serial number. Cleaned the soundboard today. There's still quite a bit of dust on there, but got quite a bit off of it too. And that will really improve the tone of the instrument because the dust on the soundboard of a grand, it's like a layer of snow. It's an insulating layer. So it really absorbs and inhibits. As far as the tuning went, this is a really awesome improvement, but it is still just the first step. And I do think, just based on kind of the heirloom status of the instrument, that we are going to want to install the humidity control device. And I feel like even though the aggressive season may be a couple months away, that we should install that sooner than later. And the reason being that the piano is new to this room, and it having just recently been moved in here, there's actually a settling period for the grand piano. So when you go to Carnegie Hall, the whole stage moves. The orchestra pit is not for the orchestra. You can pick up your cello and walk. The orchestra pit is for the 9-foot grand piano, because when you have a grand piano and you move it, even just rolling it out on stage, it takes a while for the instrument to twist to the foundation. It's got 3 points of contact, and they're going to twist as they slowly meet the new location. In a setting where they don't have an orchestra pit, something like the Flynn, then the piano is rolled around on a giant metal tripod to try to minimize the twisting involved. So I think there's a window of time here where the instrument is still squaring to the floor. We've got a little bit of season change going on. And if we install the damp chaser sooner rather than later, we can get all of the settling done at the same time. Another reason for installing the damp chaser is that if we keep the instrument all the way closed, so every single cabinet piece closed when the humidity control system is running, it will start to benefit the action parts, which, they are the same age as the rest of the piano. So there's potential of fatigue while we're trying to make adjustments, or of breaking apart while trying to fix a part. That is pretty standard for an old piano. So having the humidity control system installed and letting it really revive the wood will give us better chances of success on some of these otherwise normal adjustments. There's obviously the missing F sharp, which we do have over here, and we're either going to relocate that problem by scrapping the flange from the lowest or the highest note in order to make this more prominent note function, or we may be able to reassemble it. We'll just have to see what the rest of the components look like. There's some, sticking hammers. There's some misaimed hammers. Try to find an example. There's ones that are, will stay up in the air. They're not going back to rest because they're rubbing against their neighbor. So that's hammer aiming or squaring. This is also a really good example over here. This highest note of the section, it's just barely hitting one of those strings, so that needs to be re-aimed. That may have a stripped dog ear or a walking center pin, which can easily be addressed from inside the piano. But you can see some of that irregular spacing on those hammers. That's pretty normal housekeeping. We have one bent damper. It's the highest of the section. I don't think that's high on our list. Maybe, but if it's functional and doing its job, then we can get by the aesthetics. These two high notes have some sort of interference going on between them where I can jog one and it affects the other. That's probably a misaligned whip-in, and so we'll see when we take the action out. Also, I took up some lost motion on the sustain pedal. The sustain pedal was not functioning at all, and I need it to function in order to tune, because if I'm installing my mutes while the dampers are down, then as I'm moving the strings to install my temperament strip, it can mess up the actual seating of the dampers. So when we're muting, which is the first step of tuning, I have to lip the dampers. So I just changed that lost motion, but you can hear there's a dried buckskin up in the trap work of the instrument that should be replaced or possibly oiled if it will allow us, with some linseed oil. And then you can also see there's not a lot of side play on the, una corda or the middle pedal. There's lost motion, but there's not a lot of side play. On this one, there's quite a bit of side play. So somewhere down the list, maybe 2 years from now, we're going to want to take apart the lyre block and see if we've got a bent axle or a worn out bushing that's causing that side play. It's in itself not an obnoxious symptom, but the fact that we've got this kind of side play is likely part of the cause of that sound going on, because rather than the Pitman post rising with no bias, it's coming at it with a twist and forcing that into the trap work. But, so an old piano is politely referred to as a grandma piano. And the criteria are a little different with an old instrument. So unless it's a Steinway, and Steinway holds its antique value because you can still get parts, this is an extraordinary instrument. I mean, any piano of this era, and I can look up the date based on the serial number, but I'd put you in the, 19 teens based on the legs. The quality of craftsmanship of these old instruments is unsurpassed. The soundboard is likely just one piece of spruce, the same tree, and folded with one glue joint. So a modern soundboard is 4 to 8 inch laminations from all over the forest. So they just don't breathe uniformly, and they don't age as well. And then the high tension standards of this era of piano, it was just a bunch of craftsmen working together for decades at a time, and the philosophy was, what won't break? Whereas kind of the modern machine-built industry, we are in a race to the bottom of plastic parts and just as little wood as possible, the lightest tension that they can get. So not really any tone growth. You will not find a piano made in 2023 that will be here in 100 years. So that's bringing us back to, this is a grandma piano. So less is more. And gradual progress is lasting progress. So if grandma has lived to be 110 smoking cigars every day, let her. So there may be some clicking, rattling, knocking, rubbing that we choose not to do anything about, or that we take one step at a time and try to proceed at the pace that the piano is comfortable with. The first step is really going to be cleaning the action. So we got a bunch of dust off the soundboard, and there's likely a similar accumulation of dust in the guts of the instrument. And that means cleaning under the keys, cleaning the hammers, cleaning the whip-ins, and it will, while we're in there, give us the opportunity to do the hammer aiming and to determine if this part needs to be swapped or if we can reassemble the broken flange. Maybe both. Maybe we reassemble the broken flange and relocate it to the lowest note so that it's not frequently used or stressed, and use the old but still functional note for this hammer. So the tuning pins in the bass section were replaced and upsized when you did the bass wire, and this work is very nice. The tension on these is very good. The bass strings run a little close. This is called an A-graph. It's the front termination point of the speaking length, and this is really the biggest example of where that is just about, the copper winding is just about going into the A-graph. So that may give us an audible symptom at some point, but if we don't hear it right now, we're not going to do anything about it. The rest of the tuning pins, so, we're only seeing the very tip of the tuning pin. We see an inch of the tuning pin. There's another 2 inches of tuning pin that's driven into the pin block. So we're not seeing most of it. And all that gripping is happening from the pin block. The pin block is multiple laminations of rock maple. And again, the quality of wood that they had to choose from is unsurpassed. But they used, even back when they had the available stock, they used layers of the maple going in different directions because wood has a better end grip on the pin than it does a through grip. So you could have this incredible piece of wood and you drill a bunch of holes in it and then you jam tuning pins into it and it's going to crack. If not immediately, it's going to crack in the long run right along the grain. So these multiple layers means that as one layer or one lamination of the rock maple starts to show fatigue, it doesn't necessarily mean that the pin can't hold. But as the piano ages, these laminations, more and more of them will go. So we only see the tip of the tuning pin, and most of the gripping is happening at the bottom. And so what was done when you replaced the base wires was a new, slightly bigger, slightly wider tuning pin was hammered into the pin block. And that was necessary for putting the new base wire on. The rest of the piano definitely has tenderness on these tuning pins. Like there's laminations of the rock maple that are cracked or fatigued, where especially come winter when the air dries out, it's going to be very difficult for these pins to hold. And the traditional response, the traditional repair for this is pretty aggressive on the piano. It's either do what they did down here, take the wire off, put a new pin in, put a new wire on, or if you're really skilled, you can pop the coil off the pin and put it in the new pin. I know guys that can do that. I think that would take me a year. But there is luckily a very modern, in that we've been using it for 20 years successfully, but in the piano world that's newfangled. There's a modern solution to tender tuning pins, which is not expensive and not time consuming. It is a little smelly. In that we would be using a super thin super glue, and we'd be putting a drop or several drops where the pin meets the plate, and gravity and capillary action will draw that super thin super glue down around the tuning pin, and it becomes a glue sizing method. The glue is not strong enough to glue anything in place. We're not trying to glue the pin block. We are using this as a gap filling measure and as a pin sizing measure. It is very effective, and I have in the past had pianos where you're trying to pull up to pitch and the wires uncoiling just can't hold. And through the application of the CA glue, of the super thin super glue, it will hold. And it's when it dries, the flakes of it break off into the gaps of those laminations of the pin block. So very effective, not time consuming, not expensive, but it is an epoxy smell. So some clients are bothered by that. We want to do it in the winter. We want to see them at their worst. We want to address them when they're in their most need. You can, if you do it in the summer, either not go far enough or go too far trying to guess how much it's going to outgas. So all of these wooden components will be benefited by installing the humidity control system, which is called the Damp Chaser. That's spelled with 2 P's, Damp Chaser. They advertise themselves as the piano lifesaver, and they are a very good system. They do need to stay plugged in. There are 3 components. There's a brain of the unit, a reservoir, and a dehumidifying element. It does not collect any water, but you do need to keep water in the reservoir. So the brain of the unit will sense the relative moisture of the air in the concave under the soundboard and will either trigger the reservoir to create warm, moist air into the climate under the piano, or will create warm, dry air. And the wood still thinks it's alive, so it's sharing moisture with the air. That is, in fact, what it's doing, just season to season. And then you guys have that, this type of heater over here. These are pretty aggressive and dry. Some of them, that bottom panel will pull out, and there's a little drawer that you can fill with water to get a bit of moisture back in the air. But that is a pretty aggressive and dry heat source. So some other evidence leaning toward let's do the Damp Chaser sooner than later. The piano has been relatively sheltered by being over a bare dirt foundation, means that there's lots of moisture in the air in the winter, which otherwise would be frozen into the soil. So the piano definitely benefited from that, and it might be a little bit of a shock for the instrument to be around that dry air. And then if you're using the fireplace, that can also dry out the air. Um, so cleaning out the action of the piano, fixing that hammer, trying to square off and aim the hammers that will allow us to adjust them, and then trying to get rid of, either by oiling or replacing the buckskin, trying to get rid of that symptom. All of those, that's probably $200-300 to get all that done in one fell swoop. And then the humidity control system for your piano, depending on where you're, I can show you. Everything hides under here, as close as we can get to the soundboard. And that unit, the Grand Damp Chaser, would run you about $700. That would be parts and labor. There's a supplemental part which we don't need to install, but we may choose to install later, which is basically an undercover, and it's like a mesh to really keep the change into the instrument. That's usually something we have to install if the piano is in a high traffic area, or if the room is very drafty, then it tends to rob the moisture out from underneath the instrument. It's supplemental. It would benefit the instrument, but it's not an imperative. It's something we could determine years later would be a benefit or not. So there's a number of items on the agenda, and the time frame, kind of the sooner the better for the humidity control system, just because we got this tenderness in the pins and the weather's a little unpredictable. So if we can get that installed and allow the damp chaser is not plug and play. You don't plug it in and it instantly puts the piano at 41% humidity. It takes about 3 weeks to acclimatize the instrument. So we don't want to be doing any tuning during that 3 weeks. And then some of this hammer aiming stuff, if the piano is not all the way squared to the floor, we can't really get an accurate hammer aim either. So what my gut says is that we install the damp chaser as soon as possible, or within a few weeks, allow it to do a few weeks of acclimatization, and then the piano will hopefully be a little more used to the room as far as settling to the foundation at that same 3-week mark that the wood has been revived, at which point hammer aiming, hammer squaring. We could do this repair anytime, but taking the action out of the piano is a little bit of open heart surgery. So unless it's driving you nuts to not have this F sharp, we would wait to do this till we're into the action for the squaring, the cleaning, and the aiming. All right, that's a ton of information. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns.